outset that there's a long history of interaction between global disability standards and Jordanian policy. This stretches back to the very first UN decade on the rights of people with disabilities in the 1980s. This positive interaction continues with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the UN Sustainable Development Goals as the main drivers of change. Together, these instruments press a profound reset button on disability policy, away from charity and toward justice and rights. Inclusion in all of its dimensions is the logical outcome of this switch. I was struck by a recent speech of King Abdullah making exactly the same point, and indeed much more eloquently than I. This shift is particularly important in Jordan, whose main asset is its people. Pressing the reset button means counteracting negative stereotypes, reversing the legacy of the past, and creating space for all human talent to flourish. The national aspiration in Jordan to become a knowledge-based economy presents many opportunities to empower persons with disabilities. Leaving no one behind isn't just an empty moral imperative. It is vital if Jordan is to grow an economy into which all may contribute and give of themselves as well as benefit from. Jordan, of course, bears primary responsibility to chart a meaningful and impactful line of change. But third parties, including donor countries and agencies, also bear some responsibility. Their main challenge is not to substitute for what the government of Jordan should be doing, but to complement it in ways that enhance the prospects of sustainable change. What follows is my brief impression of the process of change in Jordan, followed by some observations on some key policy challenges. Committing to a policy of resetting and embedding a policy dynamic of change is what matters most. I note that the Jordanian constitution has been recently amended to better account for the human rights of persons with disabilities. It now includes a specific prohibition against discrimination on the basis of disability. These headline changes send powerful signals that the culture shift can and should be built upon. I very much welcome the adoption of the Law on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act of 2017. This is a pioneering piece of legislation for Jordan and indeed for the region. The explicit prohibition of discrimination on the basis of disability, together with the incorporation of the duty to reasonably accommodate persons with disabilities, is especially welcome. This concept, reasonable accommodation, is a key driver of change, and it bears further development and clarification. The government might consider assisting the process of change by developing clear and detailed guidance on reasonable accommodation, which could be of inestimable worth to employers and educational authorities alike, as well as others. There is no lack of international guidance which can be tailored to Jordanian circumstances. Given that the UN Disability Treaty applies to all persons within any particular jurisdiction, the government might also give consideration to expanding the protective embrace of the legislation to include all persons with disabilities in Jordan. This would extend some minimal level of legal protection to refugees with disabilities in Jordan. Law, even good law, may not sink deep roots unless its underlying messages are constantly reinforced. one of the more neglected parts of the UN Disability Treaty, Article 8, explicitly calls for such campaigns on the part of government to sensitise the population at large to the rights of persons with disabilities. On this point, I heard often and directly from persons with disabilities and their families on how stigma and bias keeps them at home, out of school, and unemployed and isolated from their communities. In particular, youth with disabilities across Jordan shared with me how the negative perception of disability impacted them and their families. For example, we came across a young girl in the south with a minor limb impairment who faces constant bullying on the way to school. These public attitudes, unless addressed, create a self-fulfilling cycle of exclusion. This is palpably to everybody's disadvantage, and especially if the economy and society is to grow based on inclusion. I also note the adoption of other legislation, for example, on accessibility, and indeed the fatwa issued by the Jordanian Department for the rendering of formal Islamic law opinions prohibiting the forced sterilisation of girls with disabilities. This is to be warmly welcomed. Jordan embarked on a process of change shortly after the ratification of the UN Disability Treaty. In 2007, it established the Higher Council for the Affairs of Persons with Disabilities, which is now called the Higher Council on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The Higher Council serves as a policy lead and coordination mechanism. In a way, it acts as a transmission belt, allowing in the fresh breeze of a human rights-based approach to disability into internal debates about law and policy. It performs a vital role for the state in giving tangible expression to the rights-based approach. Its blueprints for change command widespread attention. In keeping with international practice, it might also make sense for the government to embed at the highest political level, and perhaps in the Prime Minister's office, a focal point across government on the rights of persons with disabilities. In this way, ownership of the key issues and the key ideas which the Higher Council develops can be more evenly embedded, thus enhancing the prospects of change. I also note the engagement of the Higher Council with organisations of persons with disabilities. Doubtless, the changed policy landscape presents many opportunities for organisations of persons with disabilities. It changes the centre of gravity of conversations, which should now focus on understanding the tangible meaning of the rights-based and inclusion approach. In a way, this calls for new skills on the part of organisations of persons with disabilities, the skills to co-create blueprints for change. Jordan has not yet designated or established a framework containing one or more independent mechanisms to monitor the implementation of the Convention. This gap was already noted by the UN treaty body. I would urge the government to create such a framework to complement the important work being undertaken by the Higher Council. The Jordanian Parliament, whom we met, seemed to be highly attentive to the rights of persons with disabilities. This too is to be greatly welcomed. Some countries are going further. They are putting in place joint committees within Parliament on the UN Disability Treaty. Some thought, we think, might be given to the creation of such a committee by the Parliament as a way of ensuring a steady focus on ways and means of giving practical effect to the treaty in Jordanian law and policy. Data, of course, is not an end in of itself. It is a vital precondition for rational policy making. The current data on disability suggests a population of persons with disabilities of some 11.2%, according to the 2015 National Consensus. This, I think, is likely an underestimation, given estimates of at least 15% in any given population by the WHO. I welcome and support calls to improve data and data collection on disability in order to lead to more rational policy making. Inclusion, of course, is not an abstract idea. It has to work itself pure in practical policy domains as wide apart as education and employment. It is always a work in progress. There is never an end state. The following are some of my impressions of the march of this idea in some key policy domains. Take, for example, legal capacity and personhood. Personhood is a bedrock of the UN Disability Treaty. This essentially means restoring voice, choice, and control to people with disabilities over their own lives. Reform here is both practically as well as symbolically important. In Jordan, persons with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities may still be denied their legal capacity to make decisions for themselves. This is the effect of the personal status law. I was not able, in our 2-week time, to discover how many persons are directly affected. This has tangible impacts across a broad range of domains, including the right to vote. The situation undercuts the excellent work being done by the Higher Council and the Independent Election Commission to advance the political rights of people with disabilities. This is a sensitive area of law reform in Jordan, given the dual nature of your legal system. Nevertheless, I am optimistic that change can happen to respect the autonomy and personhood of persons with disabilities. There is certainly no lack of international standards around the world that could be appropriately tailored to Jordanian circumstances. Every human being needs a place they can call home, a place that reflects and holds their identity and personhood and connects them to the community. I especially welcome the move to deinstitutionalize persons with disabilities and the national strategy to achieve this in Jordan. I do see some tangible progress in this direction. Longer term, this requires changes in how services are designed and delivered to make community living a viable option for all. Jordan can learn from many countries who have gone down a similar path. Many support services which are run by non-profit organisations with limited funding struggle to actually put in place the services required. Consequently, persons with disabilities have limited access to different kinds of support, including income support, home support, family support, and experience long waiting times. While some pilot projects have shown the potential to transform services, the overall identification and scaling up of such initiatives remains a challenge, which is probably where the international community can play an important role. The recent recommendation of the Public Sector Service Commission that residential institutions be placed under the control of the Ministry of Health rather than the Ministry of Social Development, if implemented, is a major step backwards. I sincerely hope that that will be reconsidered. It seems obvious, but it bears repeating that the vast majority of persons with disabilities are not sick. Inclusive education, too, is the key to unlocking human potential. The future success of Jordan literally depends on it. As highlighted in the Strategy on Inclusive Education, the 2015 census indicated that 79% of persons with disabilities in 2015 do not receive any form of education. That's quite a striking statistic when you think about it, and the national strategy is, of course, tailored to try and reverse that. So I'm very pleased to find that inclusive education is prioritised in Jordan, with reforms in law and policy to that end. However, I am somewhat concerned that progress toward a fully inclusive education system is still at an early stage and seems not to be moving as quickly as it ought. I heard and saw graphically the numerous barriers that prevent persons with disabilities from receiving a quality, inclusive education. For example, I met 2 Jordanian girls from the Southern Valley who had to share a single hearing aid, which seriously impacted their equal access to school. Schools being run by UNRWA, who are doing a tremendous job, and the UNHCR and their partners inside refugee camps are highly limited in their ability to appropriately cater for the needs of students with disabilities. UNRWA particularly deserves the support of the international community in this regard. On the important issue of higher education, I'm delighted to find there's a move to improve accessibility for students with disabilities. Undertaking a comprehensive assessment of the accessibility and affordability of higher education for persons with disabilities, we suggest, is the next logical step forward. Inclusive employment is the key to personal freedom and empowerment for people with disabilities, and indeed for all persons, and has many beneficial effects for their families as well. I was very privileged to have the opportunity to meet a highly enterprising factory owner on the outskirts of Oman, a man who was employing persons with disabilities throughout his factory. By making the work environment accessible and providing reasonable accommodation, the factory owner not only exceeded the quota for employees with disabilities, but is highly financially successful. I was heartened by this enterprising business owner, whose example can and should be better known throughout the country. His experience shows what is possible. Employers' federations and networks of employers should be encouraged to set up peer-to-peer networks to learn about these success stories and to share their good practices with each other. Government has a positive role to play in giving tangible advice to employers on how to accommodate workers with disabilities. A broader range of policy tools might be used to generate a more inclusive labour market, such as tax credits for investments to make factory premises accessible. And indeed, public procurement law might be used to give an added advantage to enterprises that are genuinely inclusive. Having rights to enter a space is one thing, but being enabled to do so is quite another. I've also noted in my trip various significant disparities in the area of accessibility. A recurring theme during my visit was the difficulty that persons with physical disabilities and older persons with disabilities face in accessing transport that is accessible and affordable. I saw the impact this is having on access to school, medication, healthcare, and employment. The new state-of-the-art bus terminal in Amman shows what is possible. Such sterling efforts, we believe, should be progressively brought to scale. With regard to access to information and communication, the provision of sign language interpretation services seems to remain limited at the moment. I was not able to explore accessibility to the electronic environment, for example, web accessibility, but I would strongly emphasize and suggest to the government that this is one of the keys to the development of a knowledge-based economy of benefit to all. And there is no lack of legislation around the world that can be easily emulated in Jordan to that effect. Addressing the accessibility of the primary healthcare system and specialist services along with rehabilitation and mental health is a critical precondition to enable full inclusion in society. There is clear evidence, at least clear evidence we've discovered in our 2-week country visit, that persons with disabilities, and particularly refugees with disabilities, have a high incidence of non-communicable diseases, often compounding and aggravating disability. Especially wrenching to me and my team was the situation of a young father with 2 children who were born in Zaatari camp with an especially serious eye condition requiring surgery with only the dimmest prospects of access to specialist care. The absence of any respite care at all for caregivers of refugees with disabilities, whether within camps or living in urban areas, strongly correlates with extreme poverty. The new National Rehabilitation Strategy embraces Jordan's commitments under the UN Disability Treaty, but the system for early identification of disability seems inadequate and needs further development. The result is that children with disabilities can be excluded from school altogether or denied support they need and face lifelong poverty in many instances as a result. The world is moving decisively away from coercive measures toward community-based services in the mental health field. I very much welcome the efforts of mental health clinics I visited to serve the needs of persons with psychosocial and mental health issues, ensuring that community-based mental health responses embracing a biopsychosocial model and not the traditional biomedical model is vital, as well as ensuring that all healthcare interventions are based on free and informed consent. I met during my visit a number of highly dedicated, well-trained mental health workers, both those working in national hospitals as well as those working in community mental health centres and integrated into primary health centres. The reality is that the mental health system is unable to meet the current needs of the population and is stretched very much to the limit. There is a need, I think, for independent monitoring of mental health facilities and institutions. I'm also deeply concerned about legislation in place that criminalises suicide attempts where such an attempt occurs in a public place. Instead of providing quality mental health supports, persons with disabilities, usually mental health disabilities, who attempt suicide in public are, on their second attempt, subject to penalties and incarcerated in prison. Criminalisation is not the appropriate response in this circumstance. Such legislation needs to be repealed to bring it into full compliance with the UN Disability Treaty. I learned during my visit about measures being taken to meet the obligation to provide procedural accommodations to persons with disabilities in legal proceedings. I was unable to determine to what extent persons with disabilities are accessing the legal system in order to vindicate their rights. I saw the promising establishment of the Equal Opportunities Committee under the 2017 law. The legislation does not clarify whether remedies are available to those who file complaints before the committee, and unfortunately, complaints seem only to be accepted for cases dealing with employment discrimination. Also unclear is whether organisations of persons with disabilities are aware of and are using the legal opportunities afforded to them under the legislation. It's unclear whether legal aid centres and lawyers more generally are aware of this process and are making use of it. Anecdotal evidence, and I underline the fact that this is only anecdotal evidence, suggests that persons with disabilities who are precariously employed are reluctant to pursue claims of discrimination for fear of victimisation. Politics, of course, is how the public interest is shaped. Not having effective access to it distorts the process and perpetuates the invisibility of persons with disabilities. Excuse me. In relation to the participation in decision-making processes, political decision-making processes, I was pleased to learn that Jordan is continuing to address the political participation of people with disabilities. Following ratification of the treaty, Jordan moved to change its policy in regard to assisted voting, for example. Here it should be underscored that the efforts of the Independent Election Commission to employ persons with disabilities are very important in this ongoing effort and should be expedited. While there are 23 accessible model voting centres now available, the vast majority of polling stations have minimal accessibility measures in place. Most of these are in schools. So clearly progress in making educational facilities more accessible would also impact on progress in making electoral polling stations more accessible. Such model polling stations, although hugely welcome, should be clearly branded by the government as a transitionary arrangement with an insistent focus on reasonable accommodation to assist those voters who do not have access to these model polling stations. The well-known link between poverty and disability is not inevitable. The fatalistic cycle can be broken. The future of social protection, which was emphasised several times during our visit, is not only to meet basic needs, but to do so in a way that connects people in their communities and gives them a life. Given my interest and the interest of my team in the impact of armed conflict on persons with disabilities, I met with refugees hosted by Jordan in both urban and rural camps. All of humanity, I stress, owes a great debt to Jordan. The philosophy of inclusion also applies to refugees with disabilities. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to speak with refugees with disabilities and their families, to hear their stories, to know about their dreams, and to understand their unique situation and the challenges they experience. For example, I visited the Jerash Palestinian refugee camp and the Zatari Syrian refugee camp, and also met with refugees with disabilities living in the Suela district. It's clear that Jordan has been asked to undertake a very monumental task, and I fully recognise the monumental efforts being made to ensure that the protection of high-risk groups, like persons with disabilities, is achieved. I also met with the many public service providers, local and international, including UNRWA, of course, who are working tirelessly to serve refugees with disabilities. The challenge to ensure that these especially at-risk individuals and their families are not left behind is immense. We heard their voices and identified numerous opportunities to make their lives better, opportunities that are simple and straightforward. We met in particular a 43-year-old Sudanese refugee who stated that even with the active support of UNHCR, he's not able to afford his high medication costs connected with his disability because he was unable to afford or obtain health insurance. Within Gerard camp, the family had to prioritise using their limited financial assistance to send their one child with a disability to school, and thereby foregoing medication and treatment for their other two adult children with disabilities. I recognise the immense strain placed on Jordan in regard to the number of refugees in the country, and the fact that donor organisations and states continue to provide humanitarian aid, but that support is beginning to wane. Significant gaps remain to reach the most at-risk population of refugees with disabilities and their families. During a focus group discussion in Zaatari refugee camp, it became excruciatingly clear that the assistance provided is insufficient to meet the needs of persons with disabilities, and particularly those with additional support needs. Disability costs, and it generates extra costs, and if those extra costs are not met, then people will indeed suffer. Targeting programming is needed, we think, for instance, to provide additional space or a larger caravan. You need more space if you're using a wheelchair in a camp setting. The provision of WHO priority assistive products should be a priority, and indeed providing more ongoing refrigeration so that medication doesn't go off is incredibly and obviously important. The lack of access to personal hygiene products, mattress protectors, bed pads, among other essentials, has left refugees with disabilities in an unacceptable situation of indignity and places their health at a serious risk. I would encourage donors and humanitarian aid organisations to use the guidance provided by the UN Interagency Standing Committee guidelines on the inclusion of persons with disabilities within humanitarian action. What are my conclusions? Jordan has clearly set itself down the path of inclusion based on the rights of persons with disabilities. It is preeminent in the region, despite all of its difficulties, and deserves the wholesome support of the international community. The underlying predicates of this culture shift, rights and not charity, need to be continually reinforced. Recent legislation and policy strategies are all trending in the right direction. Implementation remains a key challenge. The institutional architecture for change, especially the Higher Council on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is strong. Organisations of persons with disabilities deserve support in raising their capacities to take advantage of the new policy landscape and to co-create blueprints for change. Universities need to be encouraged to become active participants in the process of change and to do so in close cooperation with civil society. The main policy challenges across a broad range of fields, which I've just commented on, reflect an uneven application of the philosophy of inclusion. This can be remedied. More attention might be paid to how similarly situated countries are nevertheless managing to push forward and innovate. Donors have a particular responsibility to adopt a clear theory of change, to identify investments that will lead to systemic as well as sustainable change, and to better coordinate their joint efforts. Jordan deserves the thanks of all of humanity for its reception of refugees with disabilities. Leaving no one behind has to mean extending the benefits of inclusion also to refugees with disabilities. This is a joint responsibility with the international community and does not fall on Jordan alone. And should I add, by way of conclusion, that the co-hosting by Jordan and Germany of the Global Disability in 2 years' time will give Jordan a unique opportunity to showcase what is possible and what it is doing, and indeed to showcase the regional dimension to the implementation of the UN Treaty on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So my statement is fuller. I haven't read from all of it, and I'm sure it's going to be available to you in Arabic as well as in English, and I'm very happy to take questions and observations. But let me first get my headset.